I'm talking with my mic already muted. Sorry about that. That's not a good way to start a program. But welcome back to Sociology 101. As you all know that have been following along, I came back from Tullahoma, Tennessee from a debate at the Why Calvinism Conference. I did a broadcast there live from my hotel room, kind of talking about all of that and the great guys I got to hang out with and get to know there at the conference. Had a lot of fun. Some of you already saw some of the interview with Keith Fauske, who's one of the funniest gentlemen I've had the pleasure of ever meeting. And yes, you can have fun with a Calvinist. It is actually possible, folks. For those that don't get out much and get to know people on a personal level outside of the debate world online, you need to do that. It's really a lot healthier for the discussions to have those discussions in person. Before we jump into this, let me remind you, sometimes I forget to do, and I'm reminded to do, this is a listener-supported program, and so it doesn't happen without you. And so thank you for those that give on a regular basis who are our patrons. If you can help support us, please click on the support link in the show notes below, or go to sociology101.com, and you can click on that support link in the top right corner. You can also learn more about Trinity Seminary, where you can get a higher theological education. And remember to download the app from ridgemax.co. That put that for us, and I appreciate them making that for us. And so you can get all of our content there. I do see so much of the comments already on the side chat. People reminding me I'm muted there, and I hopefully coming through loud and clear now. We're gonna jump right into this discussion. I have some thoughts that I want to give about the discussion or the debate over atonement, limited atonement. As many people know, when Dr. White challenged me to our first debate, I was actually asked to debate atonement. Many of you may remember back in the day, it was David Allen and James White were going back and forth through social media stuff. And James White was challenging David Allen to a debate on the atonement, because that's what David Allen is obviously known for, his work on atonement. But David Allen's not a debater, and not every preacher and scholar is a debater. A lot of them don't do that for a living, don't want to do it, don't have any interest in it. And I don't fault people for that. Everybody's gifted and drawn to different areas. But David Allen is an accomplished scholar and has done more work on the doctrine of atonement than anybody living today, as far as I'm aware of. And so I always recommend his work, because I think a lot of it's a good portion of his work, at least the big book that he has that I have sitting right over there, are quotes from reformers. That's one of the reasons I did agree that it was an unfortunate title. Now, once you accept a title for a debate, you really can't complain much about it. I told Jason that, but it's one of those things that it's called like the reformed position on atonement. Okay, as if there's only one reformed position on atonement. And that's why I think Jason pointed that out, that even his friend, the Calvinist Phil Johnson with Grace to You, talks about how there were 6 different interpretations of one particular atonement text, even among the Reformed. So among Calvinists, there are various views of the atonement, and there are various ways in which they understand atonement. And so calling it the Reformed view, as if John Owen's view is the Reformed view, is a little bit unfortunate. I think it should have been probably a little bit more specific. But nevertheless, I did want to give some of my thoughts, and we are going to play some of the clips from the actual debate to be able to go through those things. I'm going to look at a few things to help you to kind of see what's going on from my perspective, and kind of give some of my feedback. First, just first impressions. I do, and White mentioned this too. I don't know if it's just to me or to a group of people. I got to meet and talk with White a couple of times, Dr. White, a couple of times in the hallways or there in the back room, or just in passing. He may have said this. I think he did say this actually in the opener, his portion of the opener. I haven't listened back to the whole thing, where he was really impressed with someone like Jason being willing to step up and come into an environment where mostly are going to be Calvinist. He was very much outnumbered in that sense, and for Jason to kind of step up and do that, and I was impressed by that. Something I was thinking, yeah, that's going to be kind of a hard audience. It really wasn't, though. The audience was very cordial. Like I said, the guys that were there that I got to hang out with and meet were all great brothers. I think they treated Jason really well. Jason felt very welcomed. I felt very welcomed. So all of that was all good. There's nothing problematic about any of the environment. The host, Keith, was the debate moderator, and he did a great job. He even called out James White once for asking a question during the cross-examination time when he wasn't supposed to. And I just thought that was hilarious. And of course, they're good friends. Keith and James are really good friends. And so they're kind of joking back and forth with each other when he gets called out for it. But he was fair. So all of that was good. I was also really impressed with how calm and cool Jason was. He never appeared like, I kind of envious. I don't know. I think I probably looked nervous to most people in my first debate because I remember having dry mouth, and I'm sure I was pacing and all kinds of things because I was nervous. I've told y'all before, I've spoke to crowds of 20,000 people at Youth Evangelism Conference and was less nervous than I was debating, and still am. Debating is just so much different than just presenting or just preaching or something of that nature. Because there's a lot of armchair quarterbacks out there who like to critique the people who are on the stage who are actually willing to stand up and to take on that hard task. And sometimes I just think, well, get up and do it yourself then, if you think you can do so much better. And Jason, I think, handled himself really well. He came across as very professional, well-spoken, studied on the topic. I think, of course, Dr. White has done this so many times. He always comes across as very assured of himself, sometimes a little more so than maybe he thinks he does, because he does appeal to authority a lot, and usually the authority he appeals to is himself. And so it comes across a little bit like like being self-absorbed, like he's trying to make himself out to be better than the person that he's debating, and so therefore he's right based upon that. And that's off-putting, I think, to some people. It's off-putting to me, and I assume it's probably off-putting to others that see that kind of thing. And I don't think it helps us any when we kind of do that kind of thing to each other or put each other down in order to make ourselves look better. And I felt there was some of that going on. The big controversy that kind of came afterwards was the issue that and we'll play this and we'll look at it, where Dr. White makes much to do about Hebrews 7:25 with regard to the intercession of Jesus. And he's asking about this, or he's pressing Jason on this. And Jason begins to give him a response. And basically Jason's response, and again, we'll play it and listen to it yourself. But basically Jason's response is to say, well, you're on a different grid. He didn't use this words, but he's basically saying you have a different starting point, is maybe the words he used. You're starting from a different place. And therefore, yes, this text looks like it supports you if you start with that grid, if you start from that starting place, but we're not starting there. And so what Jason's doing is he's confronting James's presuppositions coming into the text, because that's what's affecting the interpretation of the text. Bad presuppositions lead to bad exegesis every time. You'll come with the wrong conclusion if you start with the wrong presupposition. And Jason has every right to challenge White's presuppositions. Now, this is the problem with a presuppositionalist. Presuppositionalists have a tendency to assume their presuppositions and not establish them. And they do that not only when debating atheists, they do that when debating each other. And so they'll start with a premise, i.e. tulip is true. Not only tulip is true, but stulip is true. And I'm not saying that in a derogatory way. That's what James White calls it, because he adds the S. So before you even get to the tulip, you have to have sovereignty. And of course, they define sovereignty as to mean theistic determinism. God determines whatsoever comes to pass through a divine sovereign decree. And so they've got stulip as their precondition, as their presupposition. And they don't establish their presupposition, they assume it. And they expect you to get onto the grid with them, within their presuppositions, and debate them within the grid of their Augustinian presuppositions of stulip. And if, heaven forbid, you don't just accept their presuppositions, but you challenge their presuppositions, then you're accused of being off topic, not exegeting the text, running off to other passages, and all host of other things. But the problem is that unless you recognize that your presuppositions will impact your exegesis, then you can't begin to even understand the critique. And so that's what I think Jason, and again, I'm going to go on Jason's program next Tuesday. Come and watch, because I think Kevin's going to join us. Kevin Thompson from Beyond the Fundamentals. I think Alana is going to be there with us as well, because all of us were at the debate. And so we're going to have kind of a powwow about the debate next Tuesday evening, I believe, on Jason's program. So tune into that. But I really just wanted to kind of talk through some of these things, because I suspect this is exactly what's going to happen on March 7th with my debate. Why? Because it happened in the Romans 9 debate. And it happened in the Steve Gregg debate with White, and the Michael Brown debate with White, and about 6 other debates with White, because this is what White does. He presupposes his stulip and assumes that you should accept it. And if you don't, he'll possibly gaslight you at times. He'll accuse you of talking about other topics, running off to other texts, all of these kinds of things, instead of recognizing that if his presupposition's wrong, then his exegesis is wrong. If his presupposition's right, then it doesn't really matter. Your findings is regarding to Hebrews 7 is obviously correct, because the reason draws near. Well, let me give an example of what I'm talking about before I'm kind of setting it up before you actually listen to the debate, so that you kind of understand what we're going through. But here's Hebrews 7. Okay, so he's talking about the high priest, obviously, and Christ being our high priest. And, he just going back to verse 21, where he says, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are his priest forever. So in other words, Jesus is the high priest for all times and for all places. He is the true high priest. So much more also, Jesus has become the guarantee of a better covenant. The former priest, on the one hand, existed in greater numbers because they were prevented by death from continuing. In other words, they didn't continue forever for all times. But Jesus does continue forever and for all times. But Jesus is, as they're arguing, on the other hand, because he continues forever, holds his priesthood permanently. So it doesn't change out. In other words, you don't get a new priest every 50 years or so. You have the same one, because Jesus is eternal, obviously. Verse 25, therefore he is able to save forever, or to the uttermost, some translations say, or at all times, at all places. In other words, that's what he's highlighting, the fact that he is the eternal high priest. He is the everlasting high priest. He is the one that is the priest for all times and all places. Okay. So he's able to save forever in all places at all times. Who? Those who draw near to God. Now, for those that are not on the stulip grid, there's no problem here. We don't assume total inability is true. We don't assume unconditional election is true. We don't assume irresistible grace is true. We don't assume theistic determinism is true. And so what does this mean to us? Those who draw near to God, he lives to make intercession for them. So who does he live to make intercession for? Those unconditionally chosen before the foundation of the world? No. Who does he live to make intercession for on our grid? Those who draw near to God. End of story. We don't need to go anywhere else to establish what we believe is true. But you start with stulip. What do you start with? You start with this idea, no one could draw near to God because they're born morally unable to do so because of tulip. And it tells us that. So everyone's born by default unable to draw near to God unless they were unconditionally picked and irresistibly graced. And he doesn't ever establish that. Hear me. He never establishes that's true. He presupposes that's true. And then he comes to verse 25 and he says, see, look, Calvinism. Jason Breda, what's your exegesis of this text? You tell us. And Jason's saying, well, I see how you think it's consistent because you're starting with your presuppositions within your framework. And so you think those who draw near to God are the elect, who have been irresistibly graced. And I don't. It's really that simple, guys. And it has nothing to do with Greek grammar. Notice, I could pull up the Greek interlinear and put it beside and do clenching of verbs, but why? What does it have anything to do with how you interpret this text in English? It doesn't. This is why White will miss the forest for the trees in many cases, because what Dr. White wants to do is get on the microscopic level where he can control the discourse in Greek. That's why he asked Jason about the hina clause and wants to get Jason talking about the weeds. He wants to get right down on the tabletop microscopic level, because if he backs away far enough, he has to get to the higher context, historical context, and he has to start defending his presuppositions, i.e. stulip. And he doesn't want to debate stulip. He wants to debate what he has interpreted as a support text for his concepts based upon his presuppositions, which you're not allowed to question. Otherwise, you're off topic. This is his tactic. This is his MO. How do I know this? I have every one of his transcripts stating right over here. All of them. He does the same thing every single time. When he's responding to John Lennox, when he's responding to Michael Brown, when he's responding to Steve Gregg, when he's responding to Jason Breda, he does the same thing every time. He presupposes Stulip and then accuses you of not doing proper exegesis if you don't enter into his grid of Stulip and assume his presuppositions are correct. Heaven forbid you challenge his presuppositions, because he will accuse you of all sorts of things. And I'm expecting him to do it on Thursday. Now, maybe he'll watch this and he'll go, Leighton caught on. So I'm not going to do that. And I hope, James, if you're watching me, please, I would love for you not to be a presuppositionalist in our debate and just assume Stulip is true before you start reading John chapter 6. That would be really helpful, because then we could advance the conversation beyond the circular loop that you've put it into, where you just keep going over the same things over and over and over again without actually contending with the actual point of contention between us. And this is why you can't really advance the conversation if somebody's a presuppositionalist. If somebody's doing presuppositional theology in a debate with a fellow brother, instead of even with an atheist, but over theological matters, then you just go in these circles over and over and over again. Yes, provisionist perspective, you're exactly right. That's exactly what White says. We must learn to think presuppositionally. What's White teaching people? Don't try to establish your presuppositions. Don't try to prove your presuppositions. Just assume them. Assume they're true, and when you're challenged on them, clutch your pearls, gaslight, accuse them of all kinds of things, label them as something. Oh, you're not on my Orthodox grid? You're not on my Augustinian Orthodox grid? Oh, then you're a Pelagian, so I don't need to have a discussion with you. Oh, you're a heretic. I don't need to talk to you anymore. Oh, you're an open theist, or you should be if you're going to be logical, so I don't need to talk to you anymore. And so I don't need to establish my Orthodox presuppositional grid. I presuppose that it's true. And if you want to try to debate me off of that grid, then I'm going to label you with some kind of boogeyman label. I'm going to dismiss you, and I'm not going to have any further conversation with you. That's Dr. White's MO. And people are catching on to this. People are beginning to recognize this is how he operates. And the only thing you can do in a debate when somebody commits a fallacy, you can call him out on the fallacy, and he's going to still accuse us of running from the debate and not exegeting the text properly. And I'm in good company, because he accused John Lennox of not exegeting the text properly. He accused Michael Brown, even though Michael Brown knows original languages and used the original language in order to defeat Dr. White's argument, and he still was accused of not doing proper exegesis. He running off to other texts, when you're cross-referencing like every other exegete does in the world, in order to corroborate your point that you're finding in this text, you use another text to corroborate your evidence. Oh, that's running off to other texts. You can't walk through the flow like I can. Really. The only difference is the conditionality of the choice. What does that have anything to do with the Greek or the flow? It doesn't change a thing about the Greek or the flow. It's again, these are red herrings that will be thrown into the debate in order to distract from our actual point of contention, which is what? His Stulip. It really is. It's his presuppositions. Presuppositions will always lead to bad exegesis. And Dr. White starts with bad presuppositions. Now, that's the debate. He may say, well, I'm starting with good presuppositions. Okay, then you need to establish that. Because if you don't, then you're not really debating me. You're just talking past us. And we're not actually getting anywhere. So this whole, those who draw near to God, on Calvinism, are the unconditionally elected ones who God causes to draw near to him through an irresistible work of grace. But does the text say that anywhere? No. If you're just reading this as an intuitive, natural reader, just somebody first to the text, you would say, oh, I guess I need to draw near to God so that he'll make intercession for me. That would be the natural reading of the text. You would just go, oh, well, I need to draw near to God so that Christ will intercede for me. That's the way you would read it. And so all who believe in him, all who know him and have drawn near to him, he always lives forever and ever at all times to make intercession for those who draw near to him. So how do I get Jesus to intercede for me, draw near to God. See how when you strip away theistic determinism and Calvinism, the text is just so simple and plain. It's almost like a fisherman could have written it. It's like it's so basic. It's so easy to comprehend and to understand. You don't have all this baggage, and you really don't need all this baggage. It just makes it much more complicated than it needs to be. Now, here's what I want to do. There's another section. Let's just cover it when we hear it, because I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, and we haven't played anything from these guys. So let me put this on the stage, and this is actually going to be the cross-examination. We're going to start with the cross-examination. This is the controversial part where he's asked to exegete Hebrews 7:25, and he declines. But it's not just like he declines outright, okay? There's some preceding remarks that lead up to his declining, and I think that needs to be included. Now, I know what Dr. White means by exegesis because we've debated before, and we had the same disconnect in my debate. Remember the question that Dr. White still plays in his opener for the Geneva, or his whatever he calls it, his Calvinism podcast that he does on his show, Radio Free Geneva. That's what he does that opener, and he plays the question he asked, and it's basically the question: would you call what you just did, that 20-minute opener, would you call that exegesis, that you would do this? And I say no. But if you hear the whole answer, what I'm saying no to is not that I didn't do exegesis and that I don't do exegesis consistently across the board. That's not what I was saying no to. I was saying no to my understanding of what exegesis is, because I'm not exegeting Romans 9 in 20 minutes, as I've explained to y'all many times before. I am comparing his exegetical findings to my exegetical findings, and I am making a 20-minute debate opener contrasting those two things, because that's the topic of the debate. Does Romans 9 support Calvinism? The topic of the debate was not who can exegete Romans chapter 9 the best, because I was never told that I had to exegete Romans chapter 9. That was never the agreement. Dr. White acts like it was the agreement. The debater guy, Nate, acts like that's the agreement. Each person's supposed to get up there and provide, in 20 minutes, an exegesis of an entire chapter that's very controversial and a proof text for Calvinism. Good luck. Nobody would agree to that. What we were doing, at least in my estimation, was making an argument, making a presentation based upon our exegetical work, our hermeneutical work, which takes hours in preparation. And so when I hear somebody say, hey, you need to exegete this passage, I think, okay, well, that means I need to go look at the context. I need to look at the verses before and after. I need to look at the context of the entire book. Who's writing it? Who's he writing to? The original languages. If there's something about the original language that might affect how one could interpret this, by looking at various translations, look at cross references, other verses that say similar things or are talking about similar subjects. All of that requires time that you can't do in less than 60 seconds, which is how much time they had. And there's something leading up to that question that a lot of people aren't even aware of and don't even see it. And so because I know what James White means when he says, will you exegete a text? I know what he means is, oh, read this text and tell us what you think it means, because that's what apparently he thinks exegesis is. But I don't think of exegesis that way. And I know Jason doesn't. And I don't think most of us do. At least, I mean, most of us that have been in seminary aren't ever taught that that's all exegesis is because otherwise anybody can do it. I mean, you could just read a text and go, here's what it means to me. That's not exegesis. I don't know. I don't know. And I think Dr. White would probably agree if he were on the show with me and we were talking about it. He'd probably go, oh, yes, I agree that, a full-fledged exegesis would be this, and this, and this. But when I said exegete the text, I meant just give me your overview of what you think it means. And oh, okay. Well, then we wouldn't be talking past each other. But the problem is that when Jason Breda was asked this, it wasn't out of context, because there's several questions leading up to this where Jason's trying to explain, hey, Dr. White, you have a different starting point. You have different presuppositions. Yeah, what you're saying is consistent within your presuppositional framework. Your exegesis seems reasonable given your framework, but I don't start in the same place you do. I don't agree with Stulip. I don't think these people weren't able to draw near to God because of the way they were born by default. I don't believe that they had to be unconditionally elected and irresistibly grace like you do. And so Jason's trying to help him see that, and White cuts him off and is telling him, you're rambling. And so no wonder Jason goes, I'm not going to have time to give you any more. I've already told you why I don't agree with you about this text. What else can I say? But the one thing Jason doesn't have going for him in a debate setting like this is he's too nice. People accuse me of being too nice, and maybe it's true in some situations, because when you're watching somebody be too nice, I know how some of you feel when you think I'm being too nice now, because Jason's probably nicer than I am. He was such a class act, very respectful, still is. After the debate, I hear people coming up and saying things, and he's still very positive about Dr. White. He says, it was a good discussion, and Jason's just he's just a good guy. And James White even acknowledges that Jason's a likable, good guy, and I'm proud to call him my friend. I really am. I think he did a great job holding his own. He presented himself very well, and the only reason I even made much to do about this was because Dr. White claimed victory because of this. And that seems, it's like the one-upsmanship of the whole, we're getting together to, the sporting event and who's going to win, kind of a mindset, the kind of the testosterone mindset of, who's going to win. And it's not just testosterone. There's also females. Here's a good example. Earlier, somebody posted this, Jazina. That sounds like a wrestler name, Jazina. Because James White destroyed provisionism and made it clear that it is unbiblical, perhaps even worse than the teachings of Rome. Also, the inability of Jason to interpret a common text is mind-boggling. These are the kinds of things that you'll hear on social media, and it's this kind of mindset that's the one-upsmanship, my guy beat up your guy, and man, it's so awesome just to watch. He just destroyed you, and you guys are just like the Catholics. This kind of stuff. I mean, it's just so. I don't know how to put it. It's the kids' table. Y'all remember the analogy I talked about, the adult table and then the children's table? I was the youngest of three boys. And so I remember the years of being at the children's table, where there's often, a lot of food fighting and a lot of bantering and screaming at each other and being ugly with each other and all kinds of kid stuff. We're acting immature like kids at the kids' table. And over at the adult table, they're having in-depth conversations and showing respect to one another, and the food stays, for the most part, either in your mouth or on the plate. And it's an adult table conversation, right? Well, there's some of us that really love adult table conversations. And I think even probably James White, for the most part, likes those adult kind of conversations, at least in my discussions with him and the things. I think for the most part, he kind of likes that. But there's a part of all of us in the flesh that still has that immature kid in us, the sporting event guy that wants to rah, rah, rah and one-upsmanship and my guy beat your guy kind of stuff. We can all fall into that. But I really see that as the children's table discussion. And it's a distraction sometimes for the deeper meat of the conversation. Like, where do we disagree and why do we disagree? And I think that's an important part of the conversation. Roxy, thank you for your super chat. So with all that said, 30-minute intro to watch a little bit of the debate here. So let's watch a little bit of the cross-examination.
What does intercession result in? When Christ intercedes for someone, what is the result of that?
And this would be a good point to just make this statement, just because I don't want there to be anything missed with anyone that listens now or after when it's recorded, is that we both work off of a different foundation of our theological premise, where I know that you would hold to God's eternal decree for God the Father to elect a certain people and then Christ to atone for those people, where my position is that Christ that has provided the provision. God's eternal decree is that the gospel is the power of God unto salvation, and that the condition is on faith, and faith, when it is applied, anyone that can and anyone that does apply faith through Christ, on Christ, can be saved. And that provision is what I just want to make sure that, so people don't think that we're talking past each other.
Did you hear that? Okay. He's already answered the question about Hebrews 7. He's done. He doesn't have to say anything else. He's answered the question. Because what did he do? He pointed out the difference in the presuppositions. Your presupposition is Stulip. My presupposition is biblical Christianity from everybody else that's not Calvinist. We believe God loves everybody and sent Jesus to die for everybody. And so whosoever can be saved, those are our presuppositions. That's our tradition, if you will. Your tradition is Stulip. an Augustinian grid based upon theistic determinism and limited atonement, tulip theology. That's your starting point. And so that's really the only difference in how we're reading this text. Question answered. And so a better reply for Jason, looking back at me being the armchair quarterback for Jason, would be to say, I know you're wanting me to exegete this text, but really I already pointed out the difference between us by looking at the grid in which we start with. You're starting with Stulip, I'm not. And therefore, we're interpreting this text differently because of our starting point. He's already answered the question, and Dr. White doesn't even see it because he's a presuppositionalist. He's trying to force Jason Breda to get into his grid with him, look at the tree instead of the forest, because then he can, talk about hina clauses and all kinds of other verb declensions and all kinds of things like that to distract from the major point of contention within the debate.
Well, we seem to be talking past each other because I haven't heard, what does the intercession of Christ at the right hand of the Father actually accomplish?
The intercession is applied to those who are in Christ. There's no Bible text that says Jesus is interceding for unbelievers. So I don't want to make that type of connection when the Bible doesn't explicitly tell us.
On what basis does Christ intercede for us?
On the condition of faith. Those who have placed their faith in Christ are now redeemed. They're now bought with the blood of Christ. Now Jesus is applying the intercession. So same thing.
Does the word faith appear in Romans chapter 8, verses 31 and following?
No, but you have to interpret Scripture and take the whole counsel of God.
So when it says that he intercedes for us, the immediate context is his death and resurrection and exaltation, right? That's the preceding part of the very sentence, right?
Okay, yeah.
Okay, why wouldn't that be the basis of his intercession? Why would human faith be the basis of how his intercession succeeds?
What do you think drawing near to God is, Dr. White, if not faith, a faith response? In other words, just because it doesn't say pistis or faith, it doesn't mean that when you speak of someone drawing near to God, that it's not drawing near in faith. And I would think that even you would believe that, because someone would draw near who has faith, even though that faith might be irresistibly given to the unconditionally elected on your system, it's still people drawing near by faith. So why you're trying to separate that, I'm not sure. And maybe that's where, that's what Jason was talking about, us talking past each other, because it doesn't seem like we're coming to the same conclusions. Roxy, thanks again for your super chat. It says, can you explain Hebrews 7:25? Frustrated to have to know Greek to interpret that means we depend not on our Bible scholars. Yeah, and if you'll rewind and go to the beginning, I already kind of went over the Hebrews 7:25 passage from our perspective. And so, yeah, it's like I said, if you don't start with the Stulip grid, Hebrews 7:25 is a very easy text to understand, and there's no conflict at all unless Stulip is introduced into the text.
Could you say that in a different way?
Since verse 34 says, Christ Jesus is he who died, yes, rather who was raised, who's at the right hand of God, who also intercedes for us. That's all one action on the part of Christ. Mm-hmm. So where do you find a place to put in human faith that becomes the operational determiner of whether intercession actually accomplishes full salvation?
I don't blame Jason for being kind of confused by this question, because, again, when you're asking a question from a completely different worldview, remember the duck and rabbit thing? When you're asking a question from a completely different grid, sometimes there's so many presuppositional statements within the question that you have to kind of think. This is where what makes me nervous about debating is not being able to follow the questioner, because I have to understand from where they're coming in order to understand the question, because our grid is so different. That's why there's a talking past each other, as Jason acknowledged. You talk past each other. And so what's happening in Jason's brain right now, if I'm guessing, and we'll have a conversation with Jason on Tuesday to find out, but if I'm guessing what's going through his brain, because he asked him to repeat it, he's probably trying to decipher what he's asking within his presuppositional framework and how to unpack that in such a way that the audience can follow his answer. that makes sense? And he's trying to do it on the spot in front of a live audience in a debate setting. That's not for the weak of heart. You've got to be willing to stand up and to do that. And that's not easy to do. And that's what Jason's attempting to do here. So for all you armchair quarterbacks, well, he should have said this or he should have said that. Get up and go do it yourself. Go try it and see how easy it is.
Well, I don't know if I understand the question too well, but you go back to verse 1 in chapter 8. There's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And so he's obviously talking to, in at least a general sense, believers. That's true. That's applied to both. Now, again, I think he's specifically talking to the Jews, but that doesn't mean that doesn't apply to any Gentile believer as well.
Okay, so let me cover that point, because Dr. White makes a much to do about Jason's comment with regard to the audience being Jewish in the first 8 chapters and more Gentile in the second half of Romans. And I know where that argument's coming from. I've heard it before. It requires nuance. This is probably the one area I kind of wish Jason hadn't introduced it, at least in the way that he did. If I was going to bring one critique on Jason, would have been that perspective requires a nuance that I know Dr. White isn't going to allow for in a debate setting, as was witnessed. And I understand where Jason was coming from it, but because of it's being introduced in a debate setting and nuance is difficult in timed responses, it's just probably not the right place for it. Instead, maybe, and again, we can talk about this on Tuesday together, but maybe a better way of approaching that was to help people to recognize that in all of Pauline literature, not just Romans, there are sections where he addresses a Jewish issue. And so something could be for somebody, but not, could be to somebody, but not for somebody, or vice versa, right? As they say. I'm not going out and building an ark. I think Kevin talks about this. I don't have an ark in my backyard, because I know, yes, he was writing that to Noah, and there's applications that I can learn from that story, but I'm not taking those commands to Noah and applying them to my own life. Okay. So you're doing an interpretive methodology, recognizing, okay, he's talking to a particular audience here. That doesn't mean there's no application for me. I just have to know who the appropriate audience is to know how to apply it rightly to my life. And everyone knows this. The fact that James White made this such a big deal, like, oh, I've never heard this view before, and this is so just outrageous that, the first 8 chapters have nothing to do with us Gentiles, and we just can't have any application for us whatsoever. And that's not what Jason was saying. Paul handles Jewish issues in some portions of the text, and he handles Gentile issues in other portions of the text, and therefore he'll address Jews and their issues at times, and he will address Gentiles and their issues at times. And a lot of times he'll point that out, like Jason pointed out in Romans 7. I'm writing to you who know the law. He's obviously writing to a Jewish audience, and he continues to speak to them in that first person, addressing them throughout the remainder of that portion of the text. And so Jason's point is that in Romans 8, the application is really more for a Jewish audience, because he's handling a Jewish issue. And he's talking about the Jewish people, the foreknown of God, which, if you look at my translation of Romans 8, fits very nicely there, because I believe he's talking about those formerly known, who loved him and are called according to his purpose. He's actually referring that. And my book, The Potter's Promise, has all the citations of other scholars that believe that. It's on my website as well for free, and I have a lot of downloads on Romans 8 if you'd like to go and look at some of those. But basically, Breda is basically making the same point in short, to say that all of these verses that White is using are really Paul answering or talking about the Jewish issue, because the big issue of that day, remember, is the ingrafting of the Gentiles, and this concept and idea of the Judaizers trying to turn Gentiles into Jews first. You have to get circumcised, and you have to follow our rituals, and Paul going, no, you can't, in Galatians, just coming after them. And most of what Paul writes, if you read Paul and understand what he's dealing with, almost everything he writes is dealing with or has some underpinning of that conflict in his culture, because that's the big issue of that day. Everything is about the Jew-Gentile conflict for the most part. And so you'll always hear him using the us, we pronouns versus the you, them, speaking oftentimes in letters written to predominantly Gentile congregations. I thank God that he's chosen you. And the Westerner hears that as the you, as the individual. Oh, you chose Bob and Susan and Katie and Bill, but you didn't choose that guy there. That's the Westerner. Here's the individual, you. The original language, though, in the first century, the corporal language, they would have heard the y'all, like us Texans, or the yous guys, if you're up north, right? That they would have heard the plural, the group. And so I thank God for you, the Gentile people, that God from the beginning, this has been his plan, like Ephesians chapter 3, 1 through 10 talks about, that God's given me the special grace for you, the Gentile people, as an apostle to you, the Gentile people, because God from the beginning has always had this as his plan, to bless all the nations of the world, which is another word for Gentiles, to bless the Gentiles through the seed of the Jews. And so this has always been his plan. And so when you see verses out of context and applied to a westernized individualistic concept, then you misapply them to say, oh, he's saying, I praise God that he chose you individuals to the neglect of those individuals, when in reality, Paul is simply saying, as the apostle to Gentiles, I thank God that he's chosen you, the Gentile, the apostle to the Gentiles. He's saying, I thank God he's chosen you, the Gentile people, from the beginning. It's always been his plan to graft you in. When you understand this context, these things it flow so simply. There's not any conflict. It's so basic, and you understand it, and it's very natural. And so for Dr. White to respond the way he did to Jason Breda, simply pointing out that for the most part, the earlier part of the first part of Romans, first to the Jew and then to the Gentile, that Romans is kind of organized that way, that he's first addressing the Jewish issues, which he clearly is in the first 8 chapters. I probably wouldn't have stated it quite as dogmatically as, these first 8 chapters are just to, there's no make it sound like there's no application to the Gentiles or something like that, because I know that that doesn't nuance well for an audience that's not following what you're saying, especially when you got a debater who's not willing to stillman you and to take you for what you mean. But if you read any commentary, I got 6 commentaries over here, you open up, all of them have various speculations as to who the majority audience is. Or, well, here we believe that Paul is writing from his jail cell in this area, and he's most likely addressing mostly Gentiles here in this particular region, because it was probably mostly Gentiles, and therefore his meaning is probably more geared this way because of commentators do this all the time. And not one of them I've ever read who says, well, because the audience is predominantly Gentile, therefore any Jewish Christians, it just doesn't apply to you. Just throw out your Bible. It doesn't matter. Nobody does that. And that's the way that Dr. White responds to Jason Breda's comment about the predominant focus of the first 8 chapters being on the Jewish problems and the Jewish issues. And Kevin and I are sitting there and we're just going, oh my gosh, it's like, this is when you really want somebody to be a good faith interlocutor and just to go, come on, man. Meet me halfway here, bro. Come on. Obviously, nobody's saying the first 8 chapters don't apply to anybody who's not a Jew. Come on. Nobody's saying that. And that's what Jason's trying to correct there in his very nice, calm way. He's handling himself very well not to get upset and frustrated with Dr. White about that. But nevertheless, that was another little soapbox. And I think Kevin and I probably felt the same way. By the way, Kevin Thompson, I don't know if it comes across on his videos, but the dude is one of the funniest guys I've ever met. He was just cracking joke after joke, and it was probably not good that I sat next to him, because I was afraid we were going to get in trouble, because I kept laughing because he just kept making so many jokes, not to anyone's expense. He just makes jokes just randomly, and he's hilarious to hang out with.
And so when he gets to verse 34, so who is the one who condemns? Christ Jesus is he who died, yes, rather, who was raised, who is at the right hand of God, who also intercedes for us. He's talking to Christians. He's talking to those who have already placed their faith and trust in Christ. And so I don't see that faith was purchased at the cross, or the intercession was purchased at the cross, or anything like that. I see that is the condition to which once faith is operated through the condition on the Lord Jesus Christ, and then they are now saved, that is when the intercession begins.
Okay, so all these people are saying, like, he didn't answer the question. He never talked about intercession or the Hebrew stuff. The intercession, the point of intercession is in both the Romans passage and the Hebrews passage. And the thing is, because Jason is at not at the microscopic level of the hina clauses, he's at the 30,000 foot level. He's seeing the forest, not talking about the trees. this is answering the issue because he's confronting the grid. He's confronting Stulip. He's confronting the presuppositions that White comes to these texts with. And White wants to get into the hina clauses and the tabletop microscopic level. And that's why oftentimes you get the talking past each other.
In Hebrews chapter 7, did I miss, while I was taking notes, did I miss your response to Hebrews 7, 8, 9, and 10, or did you choose not to address it?
No, I didn't. It's not that I didn't choose to address it, but I think that if I'm coming from the position that the intercessory work is not, I understand the logic and the consistency that you want to have within the systematic in which you hold to, and so I do want to say that's good that you want to be consistent in the theology in which you have, but I don't see. But we're working off of a different foundation. So if Jesus, from eternity past, if God did decree that there is a condition that needs to be met, and that condition is faith, and he's given us the ability, other the will, to then exercise faith on Christ, which is not a work, then we then, through Christ, are now redeemed because we have met that condition. And so the whole argument that you want to present,
you're going on and on and on. Please just answer my questions. Hebrews 7:25.
Okay, that's when things shifted right there. Okay, Jason's a nice guy. He's never debated before. White is the senior in the room. He's the authority in the room. He takes the position of authority, and you'll notice Jason kind of shuts down there. And maybe if I were critiquing him or if I were giving pointers, I would have told him to keep pressing on this point because, and Nathan, you're pointing out the same thing that I was feeling, where you're saying, why didn't Jason or anyone else push White about Hebrews 7:25, saying that Christ lives to make intercession? We are saved by his life. For who? Those who come to him. And Jason, to his credit, actually did say that with regard to the intercession in Romans 8. I think Jason probably feels like, I've answered your question. I know you don't find that it's satisfactory, Dr. White, and you think that I'm rambling, but that's because I'm addressing your stulip. I'm addressing your presuppositions. And even Breda, he's so nice, and he's saying this so nicely. He says, I understand you want to be consistent within your stulip, your Calvinistic theology, your worldview, and you feel that those who are being, who draw near to God are those who are unconditionally elected and irresistibly graced. I understand that that's what you think is happening, but that's not my starting point. And so this is not an issue for me. He's not interceding for elect people who have not yet come saved, to become believers yet, and those kinds of things like you would have to hold to. He's not. That's not what it's about. It's talking about he makes intercession for all who draw near to him, and therefore anyone can and should draw near to him so as to receive the intercession of Christ. And so Breda's already answered the question as far as we're concerned, because he addressed the problem up here on this level. And so now it's not a problem on the microscopic level anymore. There's not an issue here. And there's other examples of this. I kind of want to go down rabbit trails because there's other examples in my debates, for example, with Chris Date. Same kind of thing happened. Chris Date wants to make it about a particular grammatical issue in the text, but I already answered his argument by conceding the grammatical point and addressing the presupposition that this could only be handled through determinism versus God's omniscience. And you seem to be arguing a completely different point with regard to God's intention versus the brother's intentions, and how I had to show him I'm not contending with your tabletop level issue. I'm not contending with your hina clauses and your verb declensions, because the problem's already answered up here. If you'll get out of the forest and look at from the trees and look at it from the forest level, look at the whole picture, and then you don't have a problem anymore. So here he's called out for rambling on when he's actually answering the very question that White later accuses him of not ever answering. And that's what's frustrating for me, because, and it's not me just being biased because I'm a provisionist and I like Jason's view better. It's like, I really honestly think if I was still a Calvinist, I think I would still see this as not a fair interaction between the two, because I can see what White's doing. And I would think that even a good Calvinist that's not overly biased or blinded by his bias could also recognize what Jason has already done. He's already answered the issue by addressing the worldview, the starting point, And I'm not sure why it has to be, the one-upsmanship and blah, 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 that he refuses to exegete the text. And he's already done what needs to be done to quote unquote answer Hebrews 7 and the whole intercession thing. The S in stulip is sovereignty, which is again defined by the Calvinist as meticulous determinism, or really should be called meticulous providence is what it should be called, because God is providentially decreeing whatsoever comes to pass, and they are calling that sovereignty and adding that to the front of tulip. So it'd be ultimately a stulip, which is what he says. Is not. I'm not trying to make a derogatory term. I'd said stulip in one other broadcast, and some Calvinist came after me. Oh, how dare you! You're trying to make it sound stupid, like it's stupid. And no. You're giving me way too much credit for coming up with stuff like that. And no, I'm not trying to call it stupid. I'm calling it stulip because that's what James White referred to it as in several of his broadcasts. So
it says, therefore he is able to save forever those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. Do you see a connection between the giving of intercession and the accomplishment of saving panteles, to the uttermost or forever?
The way that you're connecting it, no.
No? Okay, then please look at Hebrews 7:25.
Okay, so notice what Jason's doing. He's saying, in the way you're taking it, in other words, on your Calvinistic grid, no, I'm not making the connection in the way you are on your Calvinistic grid. He's not saying I don't make a connection. He's saying I don't make a connection in the way you are. Do you see the difference between the two answers? Because what White just heard is, no, you don't make any connection at all. But that's not the answer that Breda gave. Breda said, no, not in the way you're connecting it, because you're on a different grid than I am. So Breda is trying to get White to see that it's because of the starting point that you don't hold to the same interpretation. And it has nothing to do with the point that Dr. White's trying to drive deep into, because you're on totally different grids. Your starting point's too different.
And exegete that verse for me. Tell me why the first part of the sentence is not connected to the last part of the sentence.
Yeah, well, I don't think I would be able to do the proper justice like today to do that, but what I'd love to do is to return to that at a later point in time and do a proper exegesis. I'd be glad to do that. So I don't.
You're saying you will not exegete a verse that is specifically on the subject of our debate this evening.
Exegete one single verse is going to be difficult because you need to properly understand the context, and the context truly matters. And so I'd rather have more study to do that first and then provide that kind of response. I'd hate to do a throwaway statement. I'm not trying to win an argument. I'm going to submit to whatever the text says, but I don't want to do that. I would rather give a proper response and do a proper exegesis.
Just one last thing. Two last things then. All right. John chapter 3, verse 17. You made a claim about it. I hadn't brought it up, but you made a claim about John 3:17 in your rebuttal period. And you made the assertion that there is something uncertain at the end of verse 17. Do you remember what you said? When it says, in order that the world might be saved through him? Mm-hmm. Do you know what a hina clause is, sir?
Yeah.
What's a hina clause?
Okay, well, I'm not going to give you the good definition that's probably going to be accurate, but I know of it, so.
But you don't know what it is?
Well, I couldn't give you a good proper definition for it right now.
Okay. Last question. You mentioned...
Okay, this is, I wanted to play that too, because that's the, I'm the Greek scholar, you're not. And I want to prove it to you by asking you a detailed question about Greek grammar and clauses. And I fully expect him to try to do this kind of thing with me as well. And you remember back when we've continually challenged him to continue to have discussions and conversations, and he said, "Oh, fine, I'll have a conversation with you if you'll only bring a Greek New Testament. I'll bring mine, no notes, and we'll just go straight through the Greek." And I go, one, Dr. White, I don't teach Greek like you do. I need all my tools. I mean, I'm drooling. I even said I'm drooling on my keyboard as we speak. And many of you who watch me, you know how ridiculous this is, because I don't claim to be a scholar in the Greek or in history or these kinds of things. I'll bring in scholars like Ken Wilson, or I'll bring on Brian Wagner, who's a Greek scholar, or I'll bring on, or I'll read from a Greek source or something of that nature, because I don't appeal to my authority, because who am I? I don't claim to be a big academic, scholar. You guys know I mispronounce words and names and concepts and ideas. I'm just a goofball here. Okay. I report, you decide. And Dr. Pritchett gets on to me for doing this kind of thing. Oh no, you're a scholar. You don't claim you're not a scholar. I've never seen myself as an academic guy. I like to think and I like to read. But I know my limitations. And so being a scholar in a particular field is not what makes you right in that particular field. For every scholar that Dr. White brings up, including himself, which is usually the scholar he appeals to, authority on is himself, I can bring another 3 or 4 scholars that debunk his concepts and his ideas. And even Bill Mounts, who's known as one of the best Greek scholars living today, takes White to task on his misuse of John 3:16 and the word whoever. And Bill Mounts is a reformed Greek scholar who's written tons of books on Greek and is the source of a lot of other professors' material for Greek. And Dr. White gives a speech on his broadcast talking about, well, I know he knows the languages, but even the Mormons can know languages, and you can still twist it and make it, your theology can still twist the languages to make it say whatever you want to say. And so if he can say that to Bill Mounts, then surely that same application could apply to him if he's wrong. And that's the whole point, is that you're going to have scholars on both sides of this debate, whether the Greek scholars, whether historians, all of these kinds of things. And I'm just going to kind of point us back to, you want to be on the microscopic tabletop henna clause level. I'm saying that the big issue is at the 30,000 foot view. You've already missed it by the time you got to the tabletop, because you have presupposed so many things that can't be presupposed before you jump into the text. And that's what we have to talk through. That's what we have to talk about on these kinds of back and forth discussions. But notice how Breda was very polite about saying, I'm not going to give this full exegesis, because to do exegesis, it requires context, looking at several verses. You've already cut me off once for rambling, and I only spoke for about 40 seconds that time. And so you expect me to now give you a full exegesis of this passage? Now, and you'll hear White's responses on his program. I listened to part of it yesterday where White was critiquing Breda about this, and he makes it sound like all I did was ask him to explain this text. No, you didn't. You asked him to provide his exegesis for this text. And that means different things to different people. Now, it may not mean that to you. It may, for you to say somebody, hey, will you exegete this text? That may mean read it and tell us what you think it means. That may be all you think of when you hear the word exegesis. But that's the same disconnect I had with you in the Romans 9 debate when I answered that question, no. Because I don't think about a presentation you give on a stage in a short amount of time as your exegesis. I talk that is your explanation of your exegetical findings. That is expounding upon your exegetical work. Because exegesis does require, as Jason rightly said, looking at the context, reading the verses before and after, cross-referencing, the corroborating evidence, looking at other scholars' views. All of those things are required, I think, for good exegesis. Now, you can do some forms of light exegesis, I guess you could call it, by just commenting on what you think a verse means. And I'm sure that's probably what White meant when he said it. And that's why I think if I would have been in Jason's shoes at that moment, I probably would have just answered the question by saying something like, yeah, it's for those who draw near to God, but we don't believe that they can't draw near to God because of the way they were born, by sovereign decree like you do. And so it's not a problem for us. This verse fits very naturally without Stulip. So just move on. Next question, please. I mean, what's the deal? And this is why James White is a very good debater. Notice what we're talking about. We're not talking about the fact that there's absolutely no passage in all of Scripture that says that Christ only died for the elect. We're not talking about the number of passages which talk about God dying not only for the church, but for the world, 1 John 2:2. We're not talking about all the times in which it talks about everyone and all and the inclusive nature of Jesus Christ, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. We're not talking about any of those things that overwhelmingly, even among the Reformed tradition, have supported a universal extended atonement. We're not talking about any of those things. What are we talking about? A refusal of somebody to exegete a text on the spot. Dr. White, whether you recognize what he did or not, he shifted the burden. He shifted the burden to Jason. And you'll hear it. You hear it in his rebuttal. You hear it even in his openers. He's the affirmative. He's the one who needs to establish limited atonement in the text. He's the one who's got the burden as the affirmative. But he shifts the burden to Jason and makes Jason on the defensive. And that's why he's really a skilled debater with rhetoric. Now, when people can pick out what he's doing, explain it to the audience in such a way that they understand what he's doing, then they begin to realize how empty much of the rhetoric is that Dr. White employs. And the fact that it's not really addressing the major points of contention. Sometimes you're able to do that on the spot in a live interaction. Sometimes you're not. Especially if you don't know how to pick it out very fast or you're not real familiar with what's taking place. And so sometimes we see these kinds of things take place, and that's where it gets somewhat frustrating. I wanted to go back and listen to the rebuttal, I guess. So let me go back here and find, it's around the 45 mark is what I've got marked up here. And just listen to a little bit of, some would say skilled at manipulation, not debate. Well, I mean, they can go hand in hand. There was a starred one here, Orthodox Landmarker. Thank you for that. If you take the early Christian model of Irenaeus about different views of atonement, and I think Warren McGrew does talk about that, and I've had conversations with him about some of those things. And so, but I appreciate the super chat as well. Appreciate that. Okay, so let's go back to here and watch.
Thank you very much, Jason, for that presentation. But I will have to confess, I have never heard that perspective ever before in my life. I have never heard Romans chopped up into pieces like that ever before in my life. I don't know anybody in church history. It's funny. Well, all of church history had this position, and you've got a different position. But I'm going to give you a presentation that's different than all of church history. Seems to be an inconsistent position to take. It seemed at the beginning I was hearing David Allen speaking. Much of the discussion about people I had never quoted. I didn't quote Calvin. I didn't quote Owen. I didn't quote any of these individuals. I gave a biblical presentation. They're interesting to talk about. I teach church history, so we could do it. But I gave a biblical presentation.
Okay, so just because he chose to give a biblical presentation, which Jason did rebut and talk about some of the biblical portions of the presentation. So you can't claim that he didn't when he actually did. But for someone in a debate to present the scholars shows defeaters. In other words, if these other people who are not biased against Calvinism, in fact, John Calvin is probably the most unbiased person against Calvinism you could quote from, right? So if I can quote Charles Hodge, a Calvinist, or a number of other, quote, Calvinists supporting what I have found with regard to the extent of the atonement, it's providing justification for my biblical interpretation. So to quote Charles Hodge or John Calvin supporting my interpretation of this text is handling the text, Dr. White. And so for Dr. White to accuse Jason Breda of just ignoring the biblical text because he's quoting from Calvin and Hodge, who support his interpretation of those texts in question, is just kind of short-sighted. And again, it's easy to call that out looking back on it, but you've got to be able to have an opportunity and the wherewithal to remember and call these things out in a timed debate. It's one of the reasons I just prefer open discussion and dialogue, so you can point those things out as they come up.
It said that the church held to universal atonement, but the reality is, anybody who knows church history knows that the early theories were things like the ransom to Satan theory, the recapitulation theory of Irenaeus, Christus Victor theory, and that the first full-length book on the atonement didn't appear until the 4th century. Those are the realities of church history. By the way, he said Karl Barth called it a Christian mythology. I want to be called a Christian, holding Christian mythology if I'm going to be called that by Karl Barth. I went to Fuller, and I got sick of Karl Barth. I truly do. We are told that Trinitarian harmony is a smokescreen. Okay. But why? What was the fundamental argumentation? We heard nothing about Hebrews at all. I'm going to be really interested to find out how you chop Hebrews up into things that are for one group and one group. It seems this is the new thing by those who are trying to oppose Reformed theology. There's a guy out there who's saying Ephesians chapter 1 is only about the apostles up to verse 14 and all the rest of this kind of stuff. And now we're being told that the first 8 chapters of Romans are addressed to the Jews. So the intercessory work of the Spirit of God for the believer is only for Jewish believers? There is no way to even begin to try to make that a consistent methodology of exegesis. It is eisegesis on steroids. Think about what is being said here. When you look at Romans chapter 1, we were told that Romans chapter 1, verse 13, uses, and I don't know what Jason believes this means, but he made the assertion, and during cross-examination, obviously we'll get right into it, but I think what he said is an indefinite or whatever terminology was used, pronoun about, but I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, as if this is somehow indicating to us that when Paul's writing to the church at Rome, and that's what he identifies in verse 7, he says he's writing to all of those who are in Rome, beloved of God.
And see, this is the reason I probably would have pushed back on Breda using this approach, just simply because now we're not even talking about atonement anymore. We're talking about an issue with regard to the audience, or who like I already mentioned, that there's certain aspects of the book of Romans that are addressing the Jewish problem versus the Gentile problem, which again, I think even White, if you put it in that way, would have acknowledged, and it would have been a non-issue. But when you make it real cut and dry, like the first 8 chapters are just to the Jews and the second 8 chapters are just to the Gentiles, and people aren't willing to understand the nuance, still man their opponent and understand where they're coming from, then you've got this kind of stuff. And now Jason's on the defensive trying to defend what White sees as a brand new perspective, or this thing that's never been taught before. And that's where I was a little bit frustrated with that, because I was like, man, atonement is like the weakest of the theological views that Calvinists hold to. And so I want all the focus to be on that issue, not on, interpretive methods or audience issues with regard to these things. Now, that doesn't mean that those things don't apply, and that they're not important to bring up in order to understand these texts in their given context. But it just can become one of those secondary issues that becomes the primary issue and the focus of the debate. And that's where it's frustrating. Nathan, thank you for your super chat. He says, thank you for your work. Don't people make their forest view based on the individual trees, though? Sometimes yes. And that's where I've brought correction, is that proper hermeneutics starts at the high level. In other words, you need to know who the audience is, who the author is, what the historical context is, what's happening at this time in history, where's the author writing from. All of that stuff is prior to the exegetical, line by line, verse by verse, Greek language, declension of verbs. That's tabletop level. So you start up here, establish the context, establish all these things, and then you move closer to the table, rooftop level, ceiling level, tabletop level, and then you get down to the microscopic level. And by the way, I can't remember Sproul's book. I've got to go back and find this, because back in the day when we were doing a whole debates about exegesis, because I was being accused of not doing exegesis and all this kind of stuff, the tired old arguments that you hear 1,000 times. So I pull up, I think it was an R.C. Sproul book on hermeneutics, because I was trying to find a Reformed scholar showing them I'm following the principles of a Reformed scholar on proper hermeneutics, exegetical work, and how to do this. And it was talking about that very, very issue, that you start here and you move down. When you start down here and you find some nuanced thing that you want to believe in, that you want to hold to, down here in the microscope, and then you try to make it apply to every other area, and you pull out away from that thing, you can massage everything to make that fit when you're really trying to. And that's exactly what many people do, unfortunately. You've probably heard it before. I'm trying to remember how it goes. Something about how proof texting is really bad because if you don't know the context and stuff, and it's stuff like follow the examples. Follow me as I follow Christ. Follow the example of the apostles. And then here the apostle Judas went out and hung himself. And then another verse next to it said, go therefore and do likewise. Okay, so I just used proof texting to show how you should commit suicide. That's an extreme, obviously silly version of how you can do proof texting. But what have I done? I started at the tabletop level, just grabbed a text out of its context, didn't look at the historical context, didn't look what it's about, didn't look how to apply it, pulled it out of its context and say, look, we're supposed to follow the apostles. We're supposed to follow their teachings. We're supposed to follow their example. Oh, here, and look at what one of the apostles did. He went and denied Jesus 3 times. This one over here, he went and killed himself. Therefore, go therefore and do likewise. So what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to deny Christ, and we're supposed to kill ourselves. You see how stupid that is? Obviously, that's silly. And I'm not saying James White or anybody else on the Calvinistic side would promote that. But what I'm saying is that it's an extreme example of what bad eisegesis and bad proof texting can do to a text. You can literally make the Bible say almost anything you want to say by just plucking verses out of the context and putting together in the way that you want to put them together. And that's the way Calvinism is basically formed. It's a systematic theology. And the way systematic theology is done sometimes, when it's done inappropriately, in my estimation, of course, Calvinists would have maybe accusations about me about the same thing. But my accusation, my argument is that all these proof texts for total inability and unconditional election, and these proof texts over here are irresistible grace and limited atonement, and all these things are just kind of propped together and put into little nice categories. And then when you're asked about tulip, pop, 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 I've got all these proof texts all ready to roll. I'm going to talk about deadness and sin, and I'm not going to look at how deadness is used in the rest of the scripture. I'm going to talk about dead like Lazarus and use that narrative out of context. And I'm going to proof text this, and how does a dead man even respond? They can't possibly respond, dead or dead. And I'm going to have all these proof texts ready to roll. And it's going to, just sound so convincing. And then right over here, I'm going to in unconditional election. Oh, look, Jacob, I loved, Esau, I hated. Pop that in there, and pop this in here, and pop this, all these little verses. Oh, look at all these verses, man. My unconditional election, man, it is solid. Look at all these verses just pop together. That's called systematic theology, using proof texting eisegesis. And when you stop, as we've done on this program, and there's a series of going through the Calvinistic proof texts where you look at each one of them in context, you understand what they mean in their proper context. Not a single one of them are supporting the point that they're listed under, if understood in the proper context. But it takes time to do that. How many months it takes us to go through that list of 15, 16, 20 verses of proof text, many of which aren't even addressing the topic that they're being cited for in proof texting. And that's why it takes time. There's a joke. We were doing the round table with the Walking Dead podcast that was there at Tullahoma. And they were joking with me, they were razzing me about my long responses, and talk about how long I take to do my videos, which this one's already at an hour and 13 minutes. So yeah, they're right about that. And then I kind of chimed back and I said, well, it takes a lot longer to clean up a mess than it does to make one. So they thought, oh, touche. They thought that was a good one. So that's true. It does take a long time to clean up messes. But anyway, Nathan's also saying, should we not be able to rebuff the trees first and then point to the forest? I think taking that approach would sway viewers. Well, I mean, the problem is that if you focus on the hina clause tree issue without establishing first the premise, the presupposition, then it doesn't matter. The tree doesn't matter. The hina clause doesn't matter. You could even be right about that. That's one of the things that I'll do with Calvinists sometimes, is that I'll just grant them their point for the sake of the argument, even though I may not even agree with the point necessarily, but I don't think it's relevant to the interpretation being offered. It's a straw man, or a red herring. It's a distraction from the actual point of contention, in my estimation. Now, I will say, Nathan, there are maybe situations where a tree needs to be addressed. In other words, a particular Greek concept or idea needs to be addressed because it's an error. And sometimes the mistake is not made until it gets to the tabletop. In other words, you're all on the same page as you're going down through the process of hermeneutics. And it's not until the tabletop microscopic level issue that there's a parting of ways. And then that's when you would address that parting of ways. But you have to address the parting of ways when it happens. And between us and Calvinists, the parting of ways, as far as how we're understanding a text, happens at the presuppositional level, at the high level, before you even get into the verses themselves. Reductio ad absurdum. Yes, that's exactly what that's called, what I was talking about earlier, where you reduce to the absurd of using proof texting like that to talk about suicide, this kind of thing. That's oftentimes can be used as an example of how people can, misuse proof texting. And so, yeah, it's an absurd way of doing it, but that often happens. All right, let's move on through this here.
Called saints. And the whole point of Romans is that there's only one church. The big emphasis he has. For example, Romans 3:23. We all know it, right? You all know Romans 3:23. Don't tell.
Again, all the focus is on that, chapter, the two divisions of Romans 9 thing. And the thing is, James White, you could just get James White to agree. Don't you agree that, for example, in Romans 7, when it says, I'm speaking to you who are under the law, that obviously there in that context, he's addressing the Jews specifically about a point. Don't you see where he actually says over in chapter 11, where he speaks to the Gentiles in first person, and he references the Jewish people separately, and he's obviously addressing the Jewish crowd there in that text. Would you acknowledge that? Yes, I think he would. Anybody would have to. Obviously, Paul says it really plain and black and white. So then you get him to that point, and then you're able to say, okay, so there's different verses, different sections that Paul is addressing different groups of people because of the issues within his mind. Remember the interlocutor thing that I always hear me talk about, the interlocutor, the objector in the mind of Paul, and we talk about the Jewish interlocutor. What's that mean? It's a Jewish person in his mind objecting to something. So in Romans 3, for example, in the first few chapters of Romans 3, it's a Jewish interlocutor who's saying, if my unrighteousness brings out your righteousness, brings about your plan, then why am I still to blame? And we point out that's a Jewish interlocutor. It even says so in Romans chapter 3. And we make the argument that that same interlocutor is the same one that's brought up again in chapter 9 in the mind of Paul. He's anticipating what the Jew who is being used by God in his unbelief to bring about redemption, if he's objecting to that, God, if you're using me in my rebellion to cry out, crucify him, when crucifying him is your plan to bring about righteousness in the grafting of the Gentiles, then why are you still to blame me for doing what your plan is? That's the interlocutor from our perspective. And so it's a Jewish interlocutor. If you put in the wrong interlocutor, if you think the interlocutor is a first century synergist opposing double predestination and Calvinistic election, then you're going to think that Paul is a Calvinist and defending reprobation. But what a stretch is that? Do people really think Paul was anticipating a first century synergist objecting to double predestination and reprobation? It seems so to me, I guess I don't mean to sound condescending. It just seems so absurd to me now, looking through the whole of Scripture. That's not what he's addressing. And when you understand that, you begin to get frustrated and you want people to see it from your perspective. And sometimes it's difficult to unpack some of those things. All right, let's go a little bit longer here in his rebuttal.
You don't know Romans 3:23. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, right? If you look at it in context, what he's saying is all, as in Jews and Gentiles together. His whole point in Romans.
Again, nothing to do with what Jason's talking about. He's not, and he does explain that a little bit later in one of his responses. He's not denying that all Jews and Gentiles are sinners. He's not, in other words, White's going down a rabbit trail on a red herring issue based upon Jason's, reference to the object or the focus of Romans 1-8. And that to me, that's why I was frustrated, because I really wanted White to be defending limited atonement. And he was able to shift the topic and talk about something to make, Jason seem like he has tinfoil on his head and just, oh my gosh, I've never heard this before. And, these passages must not apply to us anymore today. I mean, the same kind of thing he'll do with the John 6 stuff. Oh, you think it only applies to them and not anybody else. And I have not heard all of the people he's talking about who talk about it's only applied to the apostles, but I've heard him make those kinds of statements, and it's not typically, at least the ones I'm aware of, aren't typically saying there's no application to anybody but the apostles. They're just saying that Paul is addressing something that has to do with the apostles in that context, and therefore the application would be regarding what God's doing through apostles and the apostles' authority. So, for example, in Acts 10:40, I think it is, where he says these are the ones that were chosen beforehand, and he's actually talking about the 12 apostles. Or John 15:16, when he actually says, you did not choose me, but I chose you. And he's talking about the 12 that were chosen from among the disciples. He's not talking about Calvinistic election, which even White acknowledges in one of his broadcasts. So that's about apostles. And so applying a text that's about apostles to the apostles is just good hermeneutics. Now, you can debate whether it's about the apostles in a particular context or not, or whether it's about saints in general, or about Jewish believers or Gentile believers, or any number of possible contexts that you might address. But no commentator that I've ever heard who says something like that, therefore concludes, therefore there is no application to us whatsoever, and you might as well just throw the entire book out. And that's the kind of absurd reductio absurdums that you'll hear White appeal to in order to feign this incredulity, this, oh my gosh, can you believe what my opponent is saying? This is just so far-fetched. And Jason's, maybe newer to James White's tactics and what he's doing. And so I feel for Jason, because I'm kind of watching his face as he's trying to catch up with what's happening. Like, what did you think I said? I mean, what do you think I mean by that? And so that's kind of where we are.
Romans 3. See, in Romans 1, he talked about universal sin. Romans 2, he applied it to the Jews. Romans 3, he then brings them all together. He uses a bunch of passages from the Old Testament to demonstrate that everyone, Jew and Gentile.
Okay, I think he spends most of his rebuttal talking about that. And that's what was frustrating to me, is that it ended up being about that issue, and I was frustrated. Hey, Ben, thank you for your super chat. Acts 24:15 says there's a resurrection of the righteous and the wicked. John 5:28 and 29, Daniel 12:1-2 agree. Is the universal resurrection before the great white throne judgment, not by atonement cause? I'm not following you, Ben. And that's probably my bad, not yours. I'm not sure if that's something you're asking. I may have to go read those verses in context to understand kind of where you're coming from. So I apologize. Plus, I think, Ben, you're going to be at the debate in Houston, so maybe we'll get a chance to talk and I can get some more clarity on what you're asking.
Is under the condemnation of sin, and only then, halfway through chapter 3, can he then say, being justified freely. Who? Jews and Gentiles, everyone.
Okay, I can't listen to that anymore because it has nothing to do with atonement. All right, see, 121. I think it's 121:30-ish where we get back into, I think, some more of, this, the closing statements. I believe it is. And it doesn't let you really, it's close as I can get.
There's no Bible text that says Jesus is interceding for unbelievers. Oh,
no, actually, I want to go ahead and get to, I think this is the closing, some of the closing statements. And this is where you'll hear kind of the overstatements that I was talking about before, where you'll hear Dr. White kind of going on and on about why, I won the debate because Jason won't exegete a text. And
right,
that's why we made such a big deal.
We will now have our
afterwards.
10-minute closing statement from each of our debaters, beginning with Dr. White.
Well, thank you very much for your attention this afternoon to this very important subject. I simply have to summarize by saying that my argument has been utterly ignored.
No, it was not utterly ignored. All of the major points that you brought up were addressed at one time or another. You did not feel that they were properly being addressed because you assume Stulip is true because you're a presuppositionalist. And anybody who challenges Stulip, you just assume they're not talking on topic. They're not answering my argument. Why? Because they're not on my grid. They're not just accepting my presuppositions. You did the same thing in my debate. You did the same thing in Steve Gregg's debate. You did the same thing in Michael Brown's debate. You did the same thing in your response to John Lennox. This is Dr. White's MO. This is what he does.
There's no exegesis offered. Instead, an overarching.
By the way, he accuses Steve Gregg, Michael Brown, John Lennox. That none of them do exegesis. In fact, I would be hard pressed for Dr. White to name one Arminian or one provisionist who he thinks has done proper exegesis on any verse he disagrees with. In other words, it's just a way of saying my exegesis is right because his is wrong. It's a question-begging argument. It's empty rhetoric. It means nothing, and he gets away with it, and his followers won't call him out for it.
Highly unusual, utterly indefensible theory was presented as if that's enough to undo the clear teaching of Romans 8 or Hebrews 7 through 9 and the other passages that I could have gone to, but I wanted to make this a biblical argument. You didn't hear me quoting Calvin. You didn't hear me quoting Hodge. We can debate those things. We can read Roger Nicole's article and stuff like that, and I can guarantee you I've read far more on this than my opponent and those who have been giving him information.
You think you've read more than David Allen on the Atonement? Challenge accepted. I guarantee. I think David Allen has probably written more than you've read, just because, and that's kind of a jab at David because David has written a ton on the doctrine of atonement, and I've been to David Allen's library. Literally, I don't think my public library down the road here in Garland, I don't think it has as many books as David Allen has in his library. And I think he's actually read them all, and he remembers a lot of them. That's what's crazy about it. He'll start citing verses and places and chapters of things. And so, yeah, I don't, I think that would be an interesting competition. And I'm quite certain that Dr. Allen has read, if not written more on the doctrine of atonement than James has even read.
I can assure you of that. But that's not why we're here this evening. That's not what this debate was supposed to be about. This debate was supposed to be about what the Scripture says. And
Okay, so notice a false dilemma. It's either what the Scripture's about or it's about what these scholars have said about the Scriptures. So when Jason Breda brings up John Calvin, Charles Hodge, and this host of other Reformed Calvinists who have interpreted the Bible the way we do, universal extended atonement, that therefore he's not talking about the Bible. And that's obviously false.
the cross-examination, I brought us to the very text of the Word of God, and I said, what is this saying? And it is clearly, without a question, one of the most important verses on this topic. It's specifically on atonement. It's specifically on intercession. It's specifically on the audience that is in view from the biblical perspective. And I was told, I'll do it later. We'll do it.
You didn't ask him just to tell you what you think it means. You asked him to exegete the text after you called him out for rambling when he was answering that very question and answering your argument by addressing the starting point of your belief system. You're on a different grid than he is, therefore you're interpreting it differently. He already answered the question, and yet you press him on it, telling he's rambling, and then insist he exegete a text, and he understands exegesis the way the rest of us mostly do from seminary classes, as requiring going through context and looking at all of the tools and everything else that's involved in exegesis. He says, I'm glad to do that, but I'm not going to do it in less than 60 seconds. You've already accused me of rambling once. I'm not going to engage with you in trying to exegete a full text when I've already explained to you what I see as our parting of ways.
Some other time. I do not understand that. I do not understand why you would take a position on a subject when one of the key texts of the Scripture on that very subject you refuse to touch. I will be very honest. The debate ended.
He was not refused to touch. He did not refuse to touch it. He answered 2 questions about it leading up to that. And so accusing him of refusing to touch it or not addressing it is just disingenuous. And And for him to claim that's when the debate was over, that's when I won. That's the whole one-upsmanship thing. And that's what Jason even acknowledged. I'm not here to try to win an argument with you. I'm not here trying to win a debate and be declared the victor and carry it out on the shoulders of all my, my friends here. I'm here to have a discussion and to get to the truth and to get to understand each other's positions. And I've already explained to you my position on this verse, and you're wanting to demand more and want me to talk about it more when I've already told you what I see as our parting of ways.
Ended at that point from any meaningful perspective. It really did. And you may say, well, you should just leave that to everybody else. Okay, listen to me. The concept of Christ's atonement is not just something that should be a subject of debate. It is central to the definition of the gospel. I have said for years that most people's understanding of the cross, they derived from hymns, not from the Bible. They're emotional, they're not biblical. And the result is a degradation of our worship and a degradation of our theology. Only a matter of days ago, I stood in front of an even larger audience than this and debated a very sharp Roman Catholic apologist on the subject of purgatory. Let me tell you something. The fundamental assertions I have made about the sufficiency of Christ's work as sin bearer, so that his righteousness, not just the taking away of my sins, but his positive righteousness, his fulfillment of the law, can be imputed to me as the grounds of my peace with God. That is the issue with Rome. And the perspective presented tonight makes hash out of how you respond to Rome. I hope.
So Charles Hodge makes hash out of you respond to Rome. John Calvin makes hash of how you respond to Rome. All those other reformers that were cited as supporting a universal extent of the atonement make hash in how you respond to Rome. Philip Melanchthon makes hash in how you respond to Rome. In other words, if you just take his points and apply them to anyone who disagrees with him, even from the Reformed perspective, you're basically accusing all of them of making hash of any response of Protestants to Rome. Talk about an overstatement.
This is not presented to a sharp Roman Catholic. They would have a heyday with it. You say, you sound pretty serious. Yes, because I don't believe these debates are about what we do for a couple hours an afternoon at a conference. I've seen people come out of the Roman Catholic system because of the debates we've done over the past 30 plus years. Because we have consistently presented the sufficiency of the work of Christ. And no one can make heads or tails out of the idea that, well, the first 8 chapters are about the Jews, and then you divide this up there, and then, I've got this guy on YouTube who's saying Ephesians chapter 1 that was just about the apostles, and you're just left going, do you all realize the results of what you're saying? Do you know what you're saying? In Romans chapter 8, for example, we were literally told that Romans chapter 8, verse 23, is about the Jews. And not only this, but also we ourselves, having the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves grown within ourselves, eagerly waiting for the adoption.
Who are the ones who had the first fruits of the Spirit? In other words, who were the first ones to receive the Spirit? That's all it's talking about. Who were the first ones to receive the Spirit? The Jews were. It came to the Jews first. That's why when it says, I think it's Thessalonians or something, if they take the gospel to the Gentiles believe and the Spirit comes upon them too, and then they conclude, oh, look, if the Spirit comes upon them, just like it came upon us when we had faith, it came upon us first, we're the first fruits of the faith, now it's coming upon them when they have faith, then who are we to deny them this entrance into the kingdom? God's obviously wants them, otherwise he wouldn't have sent them the same Spirit he sent us. The first fruits of the Spirit is obviously in reference to the Jews who first received the Spirit. And again, I think that I have to go read some Reformed scholars to catch up and remember exactly the way they take that. But I think even some Reformed scholars would believe that the reference is to a Jewish people that have the first fruits of the Spirit. I'm not sure where he's coming from on that one.
As sons, the redemption of our body. Let me tell you something. That ain't just for Jews. That's not primarily addressed to Jews.
And again, to say that because this happened to the Jews, therefore there's no application for the Gentiles is absurd. Sometimes it's just the opposite. Look at what happened to the Jews. Therefore, we can know this is what God will do for us. He was faithful to the Jews. Look what he will do for us. He was faithful for all those who were called by his name and loved that loved him throughout the ages. So we can know he'll do that for us. He's trustworthy. He'll do that for us as well, which is exactly what I go on to talk about in our commentary. There's obvious application, and the reverse is true too. Look at what the Jewish people did in the wilderness. So don't do that. They didn't trust God. So don't do what they did. When you hear the voice of God, do not harden your hearts. That's an application for us. But it was said originally to Jews. Does that mean can it be applied? That's what Hebrews, talk about Romans 11, for goodness sake. He makes that call for us. He even points it out. Look what happened to the Jews. Well, don't be prideful then, because if they were cut off, what will he do to you? He draws the application for us. And he doesn't always spell it out that clearly for us, but it's pretty obvious that just because something is addressed to a Jewish crowd or about a Jewish issue does not therefore mean, like drawing this absurd conclusion, therefore there's absolute no application for anybody who's a Gentile. You might as well just throw your Bible out, all these kinds of things that you'll hear White say in protest.
Romans is addressed to the saints at Rome, which included Jews and Gentiles. And if you try to start dividing that up, it's because you don't believe what Paul wrote to the Romans. That's why.
That's not an
Think
argument.
about the cost. But
that's bombastic rhetoric. That's all that is. That's not somebody trying to seek truth and understand their opponent's arguments. That's somebody drawing absurd conclusions and just hand-waving rhetoric. That's all that is.
Also ourselves having the first fruits of the Spirit. We're talking about the Spirit's work in the primitive church. Do you as a believer, do you have the Spirit working within you? When we pray that the church will come to understand God's truth and stand firm on it in the midst of a world that, because of its secularism, is challenging everything that Christianity stands for, what foundation are you going to be standing on? You have to believe that we all have the first fruits of the Spirit if you're even going to pray that God would work in his church in this way. Even we ourselves groan within ourselves. Isn't that all of us? Eagerly waiting for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our body. That's language addressed to us all. It's astonishing to me. You go to John 6, you go to Ephesians 1, you go to Romans 8. Wow, I wonder why it is that people come up with ideas that this really isn't about us all. It is about us all, and the promises are all.
Okay, I can't do it anymore. And so instead of it being about atonement, what's so funny about that is that you've got a guy debating in favor of limited atonement, arguing that it's about us all. I think it was Kevin Thompson that pointed that out in our after party when we got together to eat together. He's like, well, Jason, I don't know how you did it, but you got him debating the entire time, talking about how it's about everybody. So I thought that was hilarious because James was the one where Jason was the one saying it's about a particular group of people, and James White was the one saying, no, it's about us all. And how dare you say it's not about everybody? And it was the switcheroo. That was Jason's plan all along, is James White to take the other side and try to say all and everybody, and this is for us all. And I thought that was fun. All right, well. Hour and a half. I'm trying to keep around the hour and a half mark. That's been my usual goal because I get a lot of ridicule for going too long, and that really doesn't affect me at all. If I have more to say, I'll say more. But I think I've said everything I want to say with regard to the things that I was wanting to say during the debate or say about the debate. I got my stuff in, and like I said before. If you want to hear Jason and I and Kevin and Alana, I'm trying to remember to say her name right. Alana, I'm learning. Are going to be talking about it on Tuesday night on Jason's program, And so make sure you tune in for that and follow that. Linda, thank you for your super chat. Says, thanks, Leighton, for helping me understand Calvinism and the other isms. Great for your hard work and humility. God bless you in your ministry. Well, thank you, Linda. I appreciate that very much. And I had such a great time. For those that don't know kind of what happened, there quite a few people drove in or flew in to support Jason, Alana and her family, as well as Kevin Thompson, like I mentioned, and some of his friends, and family members of a lot of the people that are involved. Some of the people from my broadcast that I did that morning there in Tullahoma, were watching it and said, "Oh, you're just up the road. You're just an hour or two away." And they got in their cars and drove. And I was able to meet them and signed a few. I didn't sign any Bibles. I signed a few of my books that some people had brought. Thank you, Ashley, for that. And got to take some pictures with a lot of people. So I had a lot of fun with that. And hearing people's stories and people talking about, how they came across my materials or why they're there or they're, it was just fun. And then we all kind of carpooled over to an Airbnb that the host had provided for Jason and his family. And we all had fajitas, and it was awesome. It was really good food, and fellowship was wonderful. We took a picture, put it there on Twitter. You probably find it there if you haven't seen it, but got to hang out. They have such great kids, and just the warmth of the people there. And it wasn't a like bash James White time or anything like that. Like I said, that wasn't the spirit of that group. It wasn't like, hey, let's get together and talk bad about the Calvinists or anything like that. There wasn't any real negativity. I mean, we had some critiques and some things that we, threw out there, but it was, there was overall just a spirit of kind of a vibe and a spirit of camaraderie and love for one another and support for one another that was really encouraging to me. And for those that don't know yet, we are having a get-together on the 8th, March the 8th, the day after the debate, because the debate's going to be over, late that night, 10 o'clock, whatever it is. And so I'm probably going to be exhausted after the debate, so I'm probably just going to go crash. But the next day, a church is hosting a provisionist only. And when I say provisionist only, even if you don't identify as a provisionist, but you agree generally with what we believe, you're welcome. And I'm not trying to say Calvinists aren't welcome. It's just that we don't want this to be about debating Calvinism in this situation. We want this to be a time for us to get together, much like you have, your Calvinist get-togethers for this, that, and the other, and conferences where you hang out with each other. That's kind of what we're wanting to do in this kind of a gathering. ProvCon meetup. Ben says he's going to be there. ProvCon 24. I think Drew made that up. I don't even know where that came from. But we'll have some panel discussions and some other things, opportunity. I also have a new book hot off the presses called Drawn by Jesus. And so you've got Drawn by the Father by Dr. White. And I purposefully picked a name of a book based off of that because it is a critique of his book as well as a positive presentation. As a matter of fact, before I ever get into any critique of Calvinism, the first portion of the book is even saying there, pretend that Calvinism didn't exist. What would we say about this passage? And we walk through the context and the passage without any reference to Calvinism or Calvinistic theology. And then after that, then we go through it, kind of comparing and contrasting the provisionist perspective on the passage with that of the Calvinist, how the Calvinists have influenced this passage and where we think they have misguided people in their understanding of this passage. And so that's the book. Again, it's called Drawn by Jesus, and it will be there at the conference. We will have a number of copies there. And it was a fast turnaround. We'll probably get a discounted cost for those that are at the debate for the book to encourage you all to get it and start reading it and marking it up and then sending us the edits because we know there's going to be probably quite a few edits along the way here because it was a fast turnaround. And so for those of you that come to the debate, you'll be able to get a copy, and then we'll ask you to have it, shoot us an email with corrections as you see them. because we're going to be making it a little bit better, and I'm going to be strengthening it even more as we go. But I wanted to have something to put into the hands of those that really are there for truth. They're there to examine the truths of these issues and really want to dive deep. What the reason I end up writing the book is because I'm gathering all this information in preparation for the debate. And I'm like, you don't have time to present maybe 10% of the stuff you're gathering, because you're gathering all this stuff about all kinds of different issues, quotes from some Calvinists who believe this and other Calvinists who believe that, and how this particular Calvinist actually holds to views that support more of your angle and your understanding. And here's a sermon from a leading Calvinistic scholar that actually supports your findings with regard to this aspect of it. And so you want to include that, and then, but you can't present that in an opener. You don't have time to do all those. You're like, where do I put all this information? This is great information. Well, I can put it on broadcast, which I will probably do here and there as we go along through this. But putting it in book form, it's where it's all cited, it's referenced, it's cross-referenced, it's reviewed, it's looked at, and so it's able to stand the test of time in a book form, and you're able to hold it and take it with you. And for those that like me, who like to sit down with your coffee and a pen and to mark up pages and ask questions and write it out, you're going to have that available to you, especially for those who are at the debate. And eventually, it'll also go up. And yeah, I was reading some of your side chat comments and getting a kick out of them. It will go up on Amazon very soon as well, so you can also order it off of Amazon. If you're not going to be at the gathering, the Provisionist gathering on Friday the 8th, you can still get a copy of it through Amazon. So that's where most of you will be getting that. So you can look for that as well. As always, thank you all for giving and supporting. Thank you for all the super chats. Thanks to those who give on a regular basis. Those who are our patrons who give on a regular basis make this possible and really help us to do the things we're doing. Even putting on this gathering, it takes some startup monies to do some of these things, to pull this kind of things together. We've got to get rooms and all those kinds of things. That's not being paid for, as far as I know, from any host. So we're taking care of those kinds of things because you give, and we're able to engage in these kinds of conversations. The writing of the book and the resources it takes to pull that together, that's because you've given and you supported this ministry. And I would love to see that expand. I would love to see that grow. There are so many just behemoth Calvinistic organizations out there with tons of financial backing and support, making them viable and able to put out content and material and curriculum and things like that. And I would love to see more resources and more funding get behind a provisionist movement. And again, I'm not even saying advocating that name. I mean, you can call it whatever you want to, just as long as you're saying God provides for everybody. There's nobody who perishes for a lack of God's atonement or provision or love. Anybody who wants to get behind that, please let us know, because we need all the support we can get, and we want it to grow. We want to expand beyond just what we're doing here in the broadcast and through my books, but maybe even see other resources develop from that. And so as you feel led, please pray about being a part of that and really helping to get the word out about God's love and provision for all people. Go now, share Christ, and show love. God bless.